Hello, my name is Amy Clark. I'm with the University of Virginia's College at Wise, and I'm excited to be sharing with you my seminar on the rhetoric of death in Central Appalachia. I'll basically be covering two gravestone studies that I've done in the past few years, leading up to one that I'm currently doing in Central Appalachia. So I hope you'll find this as interesting as it's been for me to do it. I am a qualitative researcher, and so I work a lot with material culture, and I'll talk about what that means later on. And most of my research is situated in Appalachia and the Appalachian region. So I'll tell you more about that as well. So let's get started. So the first thing that I wanted to cover was understanding the definition of rhetoric that I teach from and its role in material culture. So I use a textbook called Making Sense of Messages by Mark Stoner and Sally Perkins in my rhetorical methods classes. I'm citing the 2005 version, but there's actually a new version that was just published this year. So I'm really excited to look at that and be using that. It's a really good textbook for understanding rhetoric and real-world applications of rhetoric. So here are the bullet points of the definition that I've listed for you. Rhetoric is public. Rhetorical messages are meant to influence, and so you want the widest possible audience, and so they're always public. So we think of rhetoric as oratory. We think in terms of classical rhetoric, for example, Aristotle and Plato. But in today's world, obviously, rhetoric is quite visual. And so we talk about it as purposeful, but we also talk about it as including probably verbal and nonverbal symbolism. And so when you think about all of the ways that we're stimulated digitally, you think about all of the ways that we can create messages digitally and what we can do with our phones, that's what people are used to. So we spend a lot of time in my rhetoric classes talking about rhetorical messages in our everyday lives and how from the minute you wake up to the minute you go to sleep, you're constantly being bombarded with rhetorical messaging. Sometimes it's easier to define it by what it's not than what it is, because anything that's purely informational is not rhetorical, because rhetorical messages are created with the intention of persuading. So if it's simple instruction, like how to put a bike, like a manual on how to put a bike together or something like that, we don't consider that rhetorical. Rhetoric is also strategic. So when I teach rhetorical analysis, I teach my students not only how to recognize what rhetoric is, but also to think as critics and look for the strategies. We also talk about how the strategies are effective or whether they're ineffective, whether they're ethical, whether they're logical. And so keeping all of this in mind, let's move to an understanding of material culture and how it relates to death rhetoric. So rhetoric exists in so many different contexts and in so many different topical ways. There's the rhetoric of politics, the rhetoric of protest, the rhetoric of death. And this seems like a really strange topic for someone to tackle. But if I can pause here and give you a little bit of background on my life and how I came to be interested in this. So I grew up here in Central Appalachia where I live and teach. And it's quite a distinctive culture here. And I'm going to talk about that in more detail later on when I give you some contextual history and a framework that will help all of this make sense. But just a little personal information, I grew up with a grandfather who was a mortician, so I spent a lot of time in the funeral industry. I learned about the process of death by watching him work from the time he was called to pick up the body of a deceased person, to take it back and get it ready for viewing and get it ready for burial, and the rituals that they walked people through, the grief that people processed. I saw all of that growing up. I saw every step of it. And so it became a study for me in how that works, particularly in Appalachian culture. I also grew up with great grandparents. I was born to a young family, and so I had great grandparents and grandparents along with my parents. So I had this rich history and cultural understanding of death that was generations old. So I saw traditions that probably people wouldn't have seen had they not grown up with their great grandparents. If you take a look, and I know this is not a photograph that people are accustomed to seeing, not a kind of photograph, but this is death portraiture, and this is an example of material culture, which is the study of the beliefs and values of a particular culture using artifacts. So this would be an artifact of Appalachian death rhetoric. This hung on my great-grandmother's wall, and it terrified me when I was a child. I slept in her guest bedroom a lot, and well, she wouldn't have called it a guest bedroom. It was the grandchildren's bedroom, but this hung on the wall. And it wasn't that uncommon, really, for people in her generation to have death portraiture. Um, Death portraiture started in the Victorian era, and I guess it was a way of processing grief. It was a way of, for her, this was my great great aunt who died as a child. She died of meningitis, which was common in 1922. My great grandfather's in this picture. This is him. He was a child when he lost his sister, and it's a very sad photograph. But I would ask my great grandmother why they had this picture and why she kept it on the wall, and she said it's the only image that we have of his sister. No picture. She was so young, and photography was not that common then, particularly among people who didn't have much money. So you had to wait for a photographer to come through, and she died before they could get a picture of her when she was alive. And so this was the only image that they had of her. And for my great-grandmother's generation, death was just a matter of fact. It was a part of the life cycle. It was not something that they feared. It was not something that they worried constantly about. They also had very strong beliefs in an afterlife. They had very strong religious beliefs. And so that enabled them to process death differently, I believe. But I guess as I grew older, this image became something I wanted to think about and write about and study in the context of other things. And now I'm sort of fascinated by it. It also held some really important clues to the study that I'm going to talk about later on with gravestones of an enslaved community. It was my starting point for that particular study. So that explains why I included that picture, and that sort of explains why I came to this topic. I guess listening to the stories of my family, particularly in Central Appalachia, and being accustomed to the process of death made it something that I wanted to study. So I looked at all of this through a semiotic framework. And semiotics is the study of how semantic and syntactic symbols or codes govern how we move through our lives as we make meaning. So what we mean by semantic symbols, we're talking about what we call presentational and discursive symbols. So when we look at visual rhetoric, presentational symbols are those symbols that appear as illustrations or images. Photographs, for example, drawings, maps. Discursive symbolism is anything that's text. And when we talk about syntactics, we're obviously talking about arrangement or order. And so we look at all of those things and how they operate together strategically to create a persuasive message or to create the art of rhetoric. In the context of material culture, in the context of a place like Appalachia, that determines how we make sense of it as well. So using these allied disciplines and modes of investigation, bringing these fields together and thinking about them together, we can see how cultural objects associated with rituals of death and grief are rhetorical by examining them as messages for the living. So death rhetoric isn't meant for the dead, right? Death rhetoric is meant for the living to process and understand the messages that are encoded for us. Now, here's another interesting photograph. This is a picture of a locket containing hair of a deceased person, and this is actually a locket of hair. The hair belonged to Davy Crockett, and this was something that I saw at the Alamo in San Antonio, and I thought it was fascinating. But I've seen hair used in this manner before. Hair was a common thing also in the Victorian era, keeping braids or keeping a piece of hair, braiding a piece of hair, creating hair jewelry from hair belonging to the deceased was a common practice in processing grief and remembrance, what we call memory. So that brings me to this photograph of these 4 gravestones, and that will be significant when I talk about my first gravestone study. If you'll notice, the architecture, the size, the shape, those are all things that factor in as presentational symbols. Those help us understand messages that are encoded in the stones themselves. The order, the way in which they're placed, the syntactics of the stones, also a strategy wherein we can see encoded messages. And so all of these work together in understanding how a community encodes messages about its belief, about the process of death, and about the process of grief. So rhetorical messages in traditional gravestones are codes that enable people to understand and process death and grief, as I said. So things like the color black, symbols on graves, the iconography, the pictures that are carved into gravestones, the text that you see, the rituals surrounding burial and memory are all encoded messages. And these are the traditional codes of death. And when I say traditional, I mean, this is what, particularly in communities where literacy is prominent, where people have the means to buy gravestones, or people had the means, particularly in the 19th century, to have them carved. That's what we mean by traditional. Gravestones that have no text, no discursive symbolism, no presentational symbols present a greater challenge. And that's what I'm going to talk about in my second study later on in the seminar series. So understanding the codes means understanding the time and space that they were created in, but we also have to remember that we interpret them in a different context of time and space. So understanding the 19th century or 19th century Appalachia and thinking about the landscape and the community in which the messages were encoded is important. But we also have to be reflexive as researchers and realize that we're looking at those messages in 2020 in a different time and space. And so that affects how we encode the messages as well. It's also fascinating to think about death rhetoric as something that is meant to be infinite. It's meant to last as long as it will last. It's understood that those messages will be there generations and generations beyond. So that's another facet of this to consider, and another avenue or rabbit hole, I guess, that you can go down as a researcher when you're thinking about the pragmatics of death rhetoric. And finally, the cemetery, then, when you think in a broader way, not just the single gravestone, but the cemetery itself, becomes this cultural landscape where social trends are illustrated in a timeline of messaging, decade after decade, century after century. When I travel, one of the places that I like to visit first in a community, in a city, in a village, is its cemetery. You can look at a cemetery, and I take my qualitative method students out into cemeteries, and we walk around and we talk about how the cemetery is a reflection of that particular community's history. You can look at a cemetery and you can see perhaps where the wealth is situated. You can look along the margins of the cemetery and you can see where the poverty is. You can look at surnames and understand something about the diversity or the ethnic makeup of the cemetery. You can look at death dates and you can look at the order of gravestones and the age of the deceased, and you know if epidemics swept through. And particularly in the case of older stones, you can get a narrative or a story of how the deceased passed away. Sometimes it'll tell you it was an accident on the railroad, or they died of scarlet fever or the flu epidemic. You don't see that anymore, but it's fascinating when you do, because that compulsion to give you as much information as possible to put the obituary on the stone is very interesting. So just to give you a framework and some context about where these studies are situated and how important context is in understanding rhetoric, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Appalachia. So Appalachia is a 900-mile long region. It, according to the Appalachian Regional Commission, and that's what the ARC stands for in this map, you can see that it extends up into New York and down into Mississippi. Culturally, however, when we talk about cultural Appalachia, we don't include those states. Cultural Appalachia probably reaches up to western Pennsylvania and northern Alabama. And we're talking about those aspects of Appalachian culture that you can find that are similar. Certainly, there are urban spaces as well as rural spaces, and that creates difference. You've got different types of industries along the Appalachian corridor. The central and southern Appalachian region is primarily coal field, although it extends up into Pennsylvania, but Pennsylvania also included steel industries. Timber was once a lucrative industry. And so I would say that Appalachia is a place very much in transition in terms of its industries. But it's important to know how it was settled. It's important to understand migration patterns and industries in order to understand the death rhetoric. So this gives you a better understanding of the subregions of Appalachia, another map from the Appalachian Regional Commission. My first study that I'll talk about I'll start talking about it in my second video for the seminar, was situated in northern Appalachia and then in central Appalachia, so just outside of Pittsburgh and then in Wise County, Virginia. I put Kingsport here just as a reference point. But this is the part of Appalachia too where I grew up and where the University of Virginia's College at Wise is located. And so Appalachia is more diverse than people think. It was settled by the English and the Scots-Irish, but there was also, particularly in central Appalachia, there was also at one time a large population of African Americans, and it became more and more diverse as the coal companies built the coal mines and then recruited Eastern European immigrants to come and work in those coal mines. And so you had an influx of people from Europe in the late 19th century and early 20th century settling along the Appalachian corridor. So lots of different dialect varieties, lots of beliefs, although primarily Protestant region, particularly in the central Appalachian region. And that'll be important for understanding later. So I think I talked about some of these bullet points, but let me talk specifically about burials in Appalachia, which will lead up to understanding the studies better. So this is something that you'll hear me talk about a lot, is context. I tell my students that you really have to begin with context in order to understand a rhetorical message. looking at it outside of its context is futile, because strategy and audience, all of those things that make it purposeful, has a lot to do with the context in which it's created. So wood and fieldstone typically mark the oldest graves in Appalachia. When we talk about fieldstones, and that's going to be significant for my second study, fieldstones were readily available if you were poor and illiterate and you needed a marker for a grave and you wanted it to last. So fieldstones would have been picked up in the woods, or picked up in the fields, or picked up along the banks of rivers. Industrialization, of course, brought stonemasons who worked with limestone, siltstone, sandstone, granite, and marble. In particular parts of Appalachia today, there are still these beautiful, ornate buildings standing, even in these mining towns that have very few people left. These beautiful buildings that were built by Italian stonemasons that came to work in these coal towns. War and illness populated and expanded Appalachia cemeteries, and that was primarily the reason why cemeteries, public cemeteries were created, because people needed a place to bury their dead, their sons and their husbands during wartime. Also, pre-vaccination, you had lots of people dying at one time, entire families dying from illnesses, pandemics, epidemics, and so you see that in these cemeteries as well. In the 19th century, there's a shift to granite mausoleums and obelisks, the tall, pointed grave markers, particularly among the wealthy. They're sort of ostentatious. It's a holdover again from the Victorian period. And of course, thinking about the large Protestant population and thinking about the belief system of Protestant faith, you can see that reflected in the iconography and the epitaphs, the presentational and discursive symbols on gravestones. And so in considering all of this, we think about how cemeteries reflect the values of those in the community who tend to hold the most power. That's a lot to think about and a lot to consider, but I look at cemeteries through a critical lens because they tend to reflect particularly the hegemonic messages that we communicate in life. You see those same hegemonic messages communicated in death. But I'm also interested in thinking about how disenfranchised people, marginalized people, use death rhetoric as a means of having a final say, as a means of empowering a voice that they were not allowed to have in life. It's fascinating, I think, to think about death rhetoric in that way. And so as I move into my next seminar, we're going to talk more specifically about my first study and how death rhetoric is reflected in gender and how women are treated in death as compared to men.